The bullet missed Xavier Wolfe's head by 3 inches, and he barely flinched, murmuring instead to his sorrel mare about the poor aim of desperate men. It was September 1876 in Durango, Colorado, and the mining town had grown wild with silver fever, attracting every kind of person from saints to sinners, though Xavier preferred the company of his horse to either extreme. He pressed his heels gently against the mare's flanks, and she moved sideways into an alley with the fluid grace that came from years of understanding between rider and mount. While behind them, the drunk prospector fired 2 more useless shots into the twilight before his friends dragged him away. "That was closer than last week, wasn't it, Rosie?" Xavier said, patting the mare's neck as they emerged onto a quieter street. "Though I suppose 3 inches is generous compared to that fellow who tried to shoot me over a card game in Silverton. Remember him? You nearly kicked his teeth in before he could reload." The horse snorted, tossing her head in what Xavier took as agreement, and he smiled one of his rare smiles that nobody human ever witnessed. At 26, Xavier had spent the better part of a decade drifting through Colorado territory, taking odd jobs as a ranch hand, occasionally doing tracking work for the marshal when the pay was decent, and generally avoiding the complications that came with conversation. People wanted things from you when you talked: explanations, promises, pieces of yourself you couldn't get back, but Rosie only wanted oats, water, and the occasional apple, which made her infinitely preferable to human company. They made their way toward the livery stable at the edge of town, passing the raucous saloons and gambling halls that lined Main Street. Xavier kept his hat pulled low, his dark eyes focused on the road ahead, his jaw set in a way that discouraged friendly greetings. He was a tall man, lean and weather-worn, with black hair that touched his collar and a face that might have been handsome if he ever relaxed it enough for anyone to tell. His clothes were worn but clean, his gun well-maintained, and his reputation solid enough that most people left him alone, which was exactly how he preferred it. The livery was run by an old man named George who had learned years ago not to expect much chatter from Xavier, so their transaction consisted of a nod, some coins changing hands, and Xavier spending 20 minutes brushing down Rosie while telling her about his plans to head up into the mountains come morning to check on a ranch job he had heard about. "Fellow says they need someone who can handle horses and doesn't mind isolation," Xavier murmured, working the brush in smooth circles. "Sounds perfect, doesn't it? Just you, me, and a couple 100 head of cattle. No saloon fights, no miners trying to shoot me over imagined insults, no sheriffs asking me to track down their missing persons. Just honest work and peace." Rosie turned her head to look at him with one large brown eye, and Xavier could have sworn she understood every word. He finished brushing her, made sure she had fresh water and hay, then headed to the boarding house where he kept a small room. The landlady tried to engage him in conversation about the new bakery opening down the street, but Xavier deflected with the skill of long practice, offering only a polite "Yes, madam," before disappearing up the stairs. His room was sparse: a bed, a chair, a small table, a basin for washing. He owned 2 changes of clothes, his guns, his saddle, and a book of poetry he had found in an abandoned cabin 3 years ago that he would never admit to reading. Xavier lay on the bed fully clothed, hands behind his head, and stared at the water-stained ceiling while listening to the sounds of Durango on a Saturday night. Somewhere a woman laughed, high and bright. Glass shattered. A piano played badly. Men shouted at each other in languages Xavier recognized and some he didn't. He closed his eyes and thought, as he often did, about silence. Real silence, not just the absence of human voices but the deep quiet of high country, where the only sounds were wind through pine trees, water over stones, and the comfortable breathing of a good horse. That was where Xavier felt most himself, most real. Words seemed to complicate everything they touched, turning simple truths into tangles of misunderstanding. But silence was honest. Silence didn't lie. He must have dozed off because he woke to the gray light of dawn filtering through his thin curtains. Xavier washed his face in cold water, gathered his few belongings, paid his landlady, and headed back to the livery. George was already awake, mucking out stalls, and Rosie greeted Xavier with a soft whicker that made his chest feel warm in a way he wouldn't have been able to articulate even if someone had asked. "Ready for the high country, girl?" Xavier asked, settling his saddle on her back. "I know you are. You get tired of this town same as me." They rode out of Durango as the sun was clearing the eastern peaks, painting the mountains in shades of gold and rose that almost hurt to look at. The trail north was well-traveled at first, busy with freight wagons and stage coaches, but Xavier knew a dozen ways to veer off onto lesser paths, and within 2 hours they were alone with the aspens and the evergreens and the vast blue arch of Colorado sky. "This is better, isn't it?" Xavier said, letting Rosie pick her pace. "This is real. Not all that noise and nonsense back there, just us and the trail and whatever we find at the end of it." The ranch he was heading for was owned by a man named Thomas Andrews, who ran cattle on a high valley lease and needed help driving them down before the serious snow started. Xavier had done similar work a dozen times. It was seasonal, well-paying, and involved minimal interaction with people, all qualities he valued. The trail wound upward through forests that smelled of resin and earth, crossing streams still running fast with snowmelt from the high peaks, emerging occasionally into meadows where elk grazed and regarded Xavier and Rosie with mild interest before returning to their breakfast. They stopped at midday beside a creek, and Xavier let Rosie drink while he chewed on jerky and hard biscuits, his idea of a fine meal when nobody was around to judge. He was telling Rosie about the time he had seen a grizzly bear catch salmon in Montana when he heard something that didn't belong, the sharp report of a gunshot, followed by a scream. Xavier went still, every sense suddenly alert. The scream had been female, desperate, and not far off the trail. Another shot rang out, then shouting in male voices that carried ugly intentions even when the words were indistinct. Xavier's jaw tightened. He wanted to ignore it to stay out of whatever drama was unfolding in the woods, but the scream came again, terrified and furious at once, and before he could talk himself out of it, he was swinging back into the saddle. "Sorry, girl," he muttered. "I know this isn't our business, but we can't just ride past that, can we?" Rosie seemed to sigh but moved forward at his touch, picking her way quickly through the trees toward the sounds of struggle. They emerged into a clearing where a wagon had stopped, or been stopped. One wheel was broken, supplies scattered across the ground. 3 men on horseback were circling a young woman who stood with her back against a boulder, holding a rifle that was clearly empty. The men were laughing, calling out crude suggestions, and Xavier felt his stomach turn. He cleared his throat, not loudly, but all 4 people whipped around to look at him. The men were rough types, probably prospectors or claim jumpers by the look of them, armed and mean-eyed. The woman was young, probably early 20s, with auburn hair coming loose from its pins and a face that would have been pretty if it wasn't white with terror and rage. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her knuckles bloody, and Xavier could see she had been fighting. "Move along, friend," one of the men said, a bearded fellow with a scar across his nose. "This doesn't concern you." Xavier said nothing. He simply sat on Rosie, his hands resting on his saddle horn, his dark eyes moving from one man to the next in calm assessment. The silence stretched out, growing heavier, until the scarred man shifted uncomfortably. "You deaf?" another man asked, younger and twitchy. "We said move along." Xavier's right hand dropped to his holster in a motion so casual it almost seemed accidental. Almost. The message was clear enough that the scarred man's expression hardened. "3 against 1 are bad odds, friend," he said. Xavier finally spoke, his voice quiet and flat. "For you, maybe." The words hung in the air like smoke. The young woman was staring at Xavier with an expression he couldn't quite read: surprise, certainly, but something else too. The men were looking at each other, trying to decide if they were willing to find out if this stranger was bluffing. The twitchy one's hand crept toward his gun, and Xavier's eyes tracked the movement with the patient attention of a hawk watching a rabbit. "Don't," Xavier said, still in that same quiet tone. The tension wound tighter, a spring about to break, and then the scarred man spat on the ground and jerked his head at his companions. "Not worth it. Plenty of other entertainment in these mountains." They rode off, slowly at first to save face, then faster once they were past Xavier, until the sound of their horses faded into the forest. Xavier sat still for a moment longer, making sure they were really gone, then dismounted in one fluid motion. The young woman was still pressed against the boulder, still holding the empty rifle, her chest rising and falling with quick breaths. She was watching Xavier with eyes the color of creek water in summer, gray, green, and clear, and he realized with a start that she hadn't said a word. Not thank you, not who are you, not anything. He approached slowly, carefully, the way he would approach a wild creature, and held out his hand. She looked at it for a long moment, then transferred the rifle to one hand and reached out with the other. Her hand was small in his, cold despite the warmth of the day, and she gripped his fingers hard enough that he felt her trembling. Xavier helped her sit down on a fallen log, then went to check on the wagon. The broken wheel was beyond quick repair, and he could see that someone had deliberately smashed it. The supplies scattered around were the kinds of things someone might take into the mountains for an extended stay: flour, coffee, salt, blankets, mining equipment. He gathered what he could, piling it near where the woman sat, and still she hadn't spoken. She was watching him work with those clear eyes, and Xavier felt uncomfortably seen in a way he usually managed to avoid. When he had done what he could with the wagon, he crouched down a few feet from where she sat and finally met her gaze directly. Up close, he could see that her face was streaked with dirt and tears, that there was a bruise forming on her cheekbone, that her hands were shaking where they rested on her knees. He wanted to say something reassuring, something kind, but words felt clumsy in his mouth after so many years of disuse. "You hurt," he finally managed. She shook her head, a small, precise movement. "Those men do more than I saw." Another headshake, more emphatic this time, and Xavier felt relief ease some of the tension in his shoulders. He glanced at the broken wagon, then back at her. "You headed somewhere specific?" She nodded, then seemed to realize he needed more information than that. With movements that were careful and deliberate, she reached into her pocket and pulled out a creased piece of paper. She unfolded it and held it out to Xavier, who took it gently. It was a letter, written in a woman's hand, addressed to Miss Emma Ashford. Emma, Xavier thought, committing the name to memory. Emma Ashford. It suited her somehow, though he couldn't have said why. He read the letter quickly. It was from an aunt, or great-aunt maybe, who had a cabin up in the high country, and who was inviting Emma to come live with her for a while after some unnamed difficulty back east. The letter included rough directions to the cabin, which was apparently about 15 miles further north on a trail that branched off from the main path. Xavier folded the letter and handed it back to Emma. She took it, tucked it away, then looked at him with an expression that was both questioning and resigned, as though she was used to things going wrong and was just waiting to find out how wrong this particular situation would get. "I can take you there," Xavier said. "To your aunt's place." "If you want." Emma's eyes widened slightly, and for a moment Xavier thought she might actually speak, might say thank you or yes or something, but instead she just nodded. A single nod, definite and trusting in a way that made Xavier feel the weight of responsibility settle onto his shoulders like a physical thing. "You got a horse?" he asked. Emma pointed to the trees at the edge of the clearing, and Xavier walked over to find a small dun mare tied there, skittish and wide-eyed but unharmed. He gentled her with his hands and voice, murmuring the kind of nonsense he usually reserved for Rosie, then led her back to where Emma waited. It took some work to redistribute the supplies between his horse and Emma's, but Xavier managed it, leaving the rest in the wagon to be retrieved later or looted by whoever came along next. When everything was secured, Xavier helped Emma mount her mare. She moved stiffly, probably bruised from fighting, and he was careful not to touch her more than necessary. Once she was settled, he swung back onto Rosie and looked at Emma, who was looking back at him with those clear gray-green eyes. "I am Xavier Wolfe," he said, because it seemed important that she know his name even if she wasn't going to tell him hers, though he supposed he already knew hers from the letter. "Going to head north. You just follow and we will get you where you are going." Emma nodded again, and something in her expression softened just slightly, like maybe she was grateful even if she couldn't say so. They rode out of the clearing single file, Xavier in front on Rosie, Emma behind on the dun mare, two people who preferred silence making their way through a forest that felt suddenly less lonely than it had an hour before. The afternoon passed in that silence, broken only by the sounds of the horses moving through the underbrush, the calls of birds, the distant rush of water. Xavier found himself hyper-aware of Emma behind him, wondering if she was keeping up, if she was in pain, if those men might circle back. He kept Rosie to a careful pace, not too fast but steady, and whenever the trail allowed he glanced back to check on Emma. Each time he looked, she was there, sitting straight in her saddle, her face composed but her eyes always moving, always watching. They stopped once for the horses to rest and drink from a stream, and Xavier offered Emma some of his jerky. She took it with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes, and they ate standing on opposite sides of the creek, not looking at each other but somehow together in a way Xavier didn't quite understand. He wanted to ask her questions: why she was going to live with her aunt, what had happened back east, why she didn't speak, but he also understood, in a way that went deeper than logic, that questions could be an intrusion. Some silences were peaceful, and some were protective, and Xavier thought maybe Emma's silence was the second kind. When they remounted and continued north, the trail began to climb more steeply, winding through groves of aspen that were just beginning to turn gold with the approach of autumn. The air grew colder and thinner, and Xavier could see snow on the peaks above them, brilliant white against the deep blue sky. According to Emma's letter, they were looking for a cabin near a place where 3 streams converged, which could have described 100 locations in these mountains, but which Xavier hoped he would recognize when he saw it. Dusk was falling when they finally heard it, the sound of water meeting water, that distinctive confluence music. Xavier guided Rosie toward the sound, and Emma followed, and they emerged from the trees into a small valley where 3 streams indeed came together in a pool before flowing on as one. Above the pool, set back against the shelter of the mountain, was a cabin with smoke rising from its chimney. "That must be it," Xavier said, mostly to Rosie but also for Emma's benefit. They approached slowly, and a woman emerged from the cabin before they got close. An old woman, white-haired and bent with age, but with eyes that were sharp and clear as she took in the two riders. When she saw Emma, her whole face transformed with joy, and she opened her arms wide. "Emma, child, you made it," the old woman called out, her voice cracked with age but warm. Emma practically fell out of her saddle in her haste to dismount, and Xavier watched as she ran to the old woman and was enfolded in an embrace that looked like it could heal wounds deeper than the ones on her hands and face. The old woman was murmuring things Xavier couldn't hear, stroking Emma's hair, and Emma was clinging to her like a drowning person clings to a rope. Xavier dismounted quietly, intending to help with the supplies and then leave, to get back to his original plan of finding that ranch job and avoiding complications. But the old woman looked up from Emma and fixed Xavier with a gaze that seemed to see right through his intentions. "You are the one who brought her here safe," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, madam," Xavier said. "Found her having some trouble on the trail. Wagon broke down." The old woman's expression darkened. "Just broke down, did it?" "3 men," Xavier said shortly. "They moved along. The wagon could not be fixed right there, so I brought Emma here." "Then you will stay for supper," the old woman said, in a tone that made it clear this was not a suggestion. "And the night, I expect, unless you fancy riding these trails in the dark. I am called Ruth Ashford, and this is my niece Emma, who you have already met in a manner of speaking." Xavier wanted to protest, to say he needed to keep moving, but Ruth was already turning back toward the cabin with Emma still under one arm. And somehow he found himself unsaddling both horses and settling them in the small lean-to stable behind the cabin where a sturdy mountain pony already resided. He brushed them both down, made sure they had water and grain, and told Rosie in a quiet voice that this was just for one night, and then they would get back to their own plans. When he entered the cabin, ducking his head to clear the low doorframe, he found it surprisingly comfortable. One large room with a sleeping loft, a stone fireplace, shelves lined with books and jars of preserved food, braided rugs on the floor, and the smell of something cooking that made Xavier's stomach remind him he had eaten nothing but jerky since morning. Emma was washing her face and hands in a basin, and Ruth was stirring something in a pot over the fire. They both looked up when Xavier entered, and he felt suddenly large and awkward, like he was intruding on something private. "Sit, sit," Ruth commanded, gesturing to a chair at the rough wooden table. "Emma, get our guest some water, and find the salve for your hands, child." Emma moved to obey, and Xavier sat reluctantly at the table, holding his hat in his hands and trying to figure out how to politely eat and leave without seeming rude. Ruth served up bowls of stew that was better than anything Xavier had tasted in months, along with fresh bread that Emma sliced and buttered. And for a while the only sounds were eating and the crackle of the fire. Ruth, however, was not one to let silence stand when she wanted information. Between bites, she extracted from Xavier the story of finding Emma, the confrontation with the 3 men, and the journey to the cabin. Xavier answered in as few words as possible, uncomfortably aware of Emma listening while she pretended to focus on her food. "You saved my niece from a terrible fate," Ruth said when Xavier finished his sparse account. "I am more grateful than I can say." "Just did what anyone would do," Xavier muttered. "We both know that is not true," Ruth said sharply. "Plenty of men would have ridden right past, and plenty more would have been no better than those 3. You are a good man, Xavier Wolfe, whether you will admit it or not." Xavier felt his neck get hot, and he focused very intently on his stew. Across the table, Emma was watching him with those clear eyes, and when he accidentally met her gaze, she did something unexpected. She smiled. A real smile this time, one that reached her eyes and transformed her whole face, and Xavier felt something shift in his chest like a stone being moved aside. After supper, Ruth insisted that Xavier take the sleeping loft while she and Emma would share the large bed on the main floor. Xavier protested that he could sleep in the stable with the horses, but Ruth would not hear of it, and he eventually gave in because it was clear that arguing with Ruth Ashford was a losing proposition. Emma brought him blankets and a pillow, moving quietly around the cabin in a way that suggested she was used to being unobtrusive, and when she handed him the bedding, her fingers brushed his, and she mouthed two words he could just barely make out. "Thank you." Xavier nodded, not trusting himself to speak, and climbed up to the loft while Ruth and Emma got ready for bed below. He lay on the simple pallet, listening to their murmured conversation, Ruth's voice asking gentle questions, Emma's silence punctuated by occasional sounds that might have been affirmations or denials. He heard Ruth say something about healing, about time, about being safe now, and he heard what might have been Emma crying very quietly, and then Ruth singing something soft and old until the crying stopped. Xavier stared at the rough beams of the ceiling and thought about silence. Emma's silence was different from his, he realized. Xavier chose not to speak because words complicated things, because people wanted too much when you talked to them, because he preferred the company of his horse to the company of humans. But Emma's silence seemed like something else, something born of hurt, maybe, or fear, or a decision that speaking was more dangerous than staying quiet. He wondered what had happened back east, what had driven her to a cabin in the high country with an elderly aunt, what had put that look in her eyes like she was always expecting the next bad thing to happen. It was not his business, he told himself. He would leave in the morning, continue on to the ranch job, and forget about Emma Ashford and her clear eyes and her silence that somehow felt like it understood things he had never been able to explain even to himself. This was just an interruption, a detour, nothing that would change his carefully solitary life. But when morning came, gray and cool with the promise of autumn, and Xavier climbed down from the loft to find Emma already awake and making coffee while Ruth still slept, everything he had told himself the night before seemed less certain. Emma looked up when she heard him on the ladder, and she held out a cup of coffee that steamed in the cold air. Xavier took it, and their hands touched again, and this time neither of them pulled away immediately. "Thank you," Xavier said quietly, meaning the coffee but maybe meaning something more. Emma nodded, then surprised him by gesturing toward the door and then to herself and him, a clear invitation to step outside together. Xavier followed her out into the dawn-lit valley, where mist was rising from the 3 streams and the air smelled of pine and morning. They walked together to the edge of the water, not speaking, just standing side by side while the world woke up around them. Xavier sipped his coffee and tried to think of something to say, some way to ask the questions he had without prying. But Emma saved him the trouble. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small leather journal and a pencil. She opened the journal to a fresh page and began to write in a neat, clear hand. When she finished, she held it out for Xavier to read. "I can speak," the note said. "I choose not to. After what happened back in Philadelphia, I decided words were dangerous things that could be twisted and used against you. My fiancé used my own words to make everyone believe I was hysterical, unbalanced. When I tried to tell people what he did, they said I was making up stories. So now I do not speak. I am not ready to speak, but I wanted you to know it is a choice, not an affliction. And I wanted to say thank you properly for saving me yesterday. I would be dead or worse if not for you." Xavier read the note twice, feeling anger rise up in his chest at this unknown fiancé, who had hurt Emma badly enough that she gave up speaking entirely. He understood it, though, in a way that surprised him, the desire to withdraw from a world that had proven itself cruel, to protect yourself with silence because words had failed you. "Words are overrated anyway," Xavier said finally, handing the journal back. "I mostly talk to my horse." Emma's eyes widened, then crinkled at the corners as she smiled, and Xavier realized he had made a joke, something he almost never did. She wrote in her journal again and showed him. "Is your horse a good conversationalist?" "Better than most people," Xavier said seriously. "She never argues, never asks nosy questions, and never tries to shoot me over a poker game." This time Emma actually laughed, a sound she must have made without thinking because she immediately looked startled, like she had surprised herself. But she did not look unhappy about it, and Xavier found himself smiling back, feeling something warm and unfamiliar spreading through his chest. They stood together by the water for a while longer, not speaking but communicating in a language. Xavier was only beginning to understand the language of shared silence, of gestures and glances, of simply being present without needing to fill every moment with noise. When they finally walked back to the cabin, Ruth was awake and making breakfast, and she looked between Xavier and Emma with an expression of satisfied knowing that made Xavier nervous in a way he could not quite define. Over breakfast, Ruth laid out a proposition. She was getting old, she said bluntly, and while she could manage on her own, having Emma here would be a blessing. But the cabin needed work before winter set in, proper wood to be chopped and stacked, chinking to be repaired, supplies to be brought up from Durango, and a dozen other tasks that were beyond what two women could easily manage, especially when one of those women had joints that ached in the cold and the other was recovering from trauma. "I would pay you for the work," Ruth said, looking at Xavier directly. "Fair wages plus room and board could probably keep you busy for 2, maybe 3 weeks if you were willing." Xavier opened his mouth to say no, to explain about the ranch job, to stick to his plan of isolation and simplicity. But then he made the mistake of glancing at Emma. She was looking at him with those clear eyes, and there was something in her expression, not quite hope, not quite pleading, but something that made Xavier realize that maybe Emma felt as comfortable in his silence as he felt in hers. That maybe, for the first time in a long time, he had met someone who did not need him to be anything other than what he was. "I could stay for a couple weeks," Xavier heard himself say. "The ranch job will still be there come October." Ruth beamed, and Emma's whole face brightened in a way that made Xavier forget for a moment to be worried about what he was getting himself into. They spent the rest of the day organizing the work that needed doing, and Xavier realized that Ruth had not exaggerated. There was easily 3 weeks of labor here, maybe more. The woodpile needed to be doubled, the roof needed patching, the stable needed expanding to properly house 3 horses through the winter, and the trail down to the main path needed clearing before snow made it impassable. Xavier set to work with the kind of focus he usually reserved for tracking or riding, and as he worked, he found himself falling into a rhythm with Emma that felt as natural as breathing. She would appear beside him with water or tools, anticipating what he needed before he asked. They developed a system of small gestures and nods that conveyed information more efficiently than most people's lengthy conversations. When Xavier was chopping wood, Emma would stack it. When he was on the roof patching shingles, Emma would hand up supplies. When he was working on the stable, Emma would bring grain and brush the horses, murmuring to them in a voice too low for Xavier to hear, but that seemed to calm them. At night, they would eat together. Emma, and Xavier and Ruth would tell stories about her life in these mountains, about Emma's mother who had been her favorite niece, about the old days when Durango was nothing but a camp, and the railroad had not yet arrived. Emma would listen with rapt attention, and Xavier would listen while pretending not to, and sometimes Emma would catch his eye across the table, and they would share a small smile like they were in on some joke nobody else understood. After a week, Xavier realized with some alarm that he was happy. Not content, not satisfied, but actually happy in a way he could not remember being since he was a boy, before his own family had fallen apart in ways he still did not like to think about. He was happy working beside Emma in comfortable silence, happy to come in from chopping wood to find coffee waiting and Emma's smile, happy to sit by the fire in the evening and listen to Ruth's stories while Emma sketched in her journal and the wind howled outside. He told himself it was temporary. He was just helping out, earning some money, and then he would move on the way he always moved on. But the work kept finding ways to expand, and Xavier kept finding reasons to stay one more day, and then another, and then another. Emma, for her part, seemed to be healing. The bruises faded from her face, and some of the wariness left her eyes. She smiled more often, laughed occasionally at Xavier's rare jokes, and began to move around the cabin and the valley like she belonged there, like she was putting down roots. She still did not speak out loud, but she communicated constantly through her journal, through gestures, through the kind of meaningful looks that Xavier found he could read as easily as words on a page. One afternoon in late September, when the aspens had turned fully gold and the air had the sharp bite of coming winter, Xavier was working on expanding the stable when Emma appeared with 2 cups of coffee and a question in her eyes. She handed him a cup, then opened her journal and showed him what she had written. "Will you tell me about yourself? You know my story now from my aunt, but I know nothing about you except that you talk to your horse and you are the kindest man I have ever met." Xavier felt heat rise in his neck at that last part, and he took a long sip of coffee to buy himself time. Nobody had ever asked about his past in a way that felt genuinely curious rather than nosy, and he found himself wanting to answer honestly in a way that surprised him. "Not much to tell," he said slowly. "Born in Kansas, family farm. Parents died of fever when I was 15. Older brother took over the farm, did not much want me around. Reminded him of our parents, I guess. So I left, came west, did whatever work I could find. Discovered I was better with animals than people, horses especially. Never saw much reason to settle down or talk more than necessary." He paused, then added more quietly, "Always figured I was meant to be alone. Seemed simpler that way." Emma was watching him intently, and when he finished, she reached out and touched his hand where it rested on the stable wall. Just a brief touch, but it sent warmth through Xavier's whole arm. She wrote quickly in her journal, "Maybe we are both meant to be alone together." Xavier looked at those words for a long time, at the neat letters and the idea behind them that seemed both impossible and inevitable. He looked up at Emma, at her clear eyes and her soft smile, and he realized that somewhere in the past 2 weeks he had stopped thinking of her as a stranger he had helped and started thinking of her as something else entirely, something precious, something he did not want to ride away from. "Maybe," he said, his voice rough, "maybe we are." They stood there in the autumn sunlight, hands not quite touching, and Xavier felt the walls he had built around himself over the past decade beginning to crack. It was terrifying and exhilarating at once, and he had no idea what to do with the feelings rising up in his chest like water from a spring. Emma solved the problem by simply staying close while Xavier went back to work on the stable. She did not push, did not demand, just existed beside him in a way that felt right. And when Ruth called them in for supper that evening, They walked back to the cabin side by side, their hands brushing occasionally in a way that Xavier was fairly sure was not accidental. That night, after Ruth had gone to bed and Xavier was preparing to climb up to the loft, Emma stopped him with a hand on his arm. She gestured for him to wait, then disappeared into the area where Ruth kept her books. She came back with a slim volume and pressed it into Xavier's hands. It was the book of poetry he had mentioned once in passing, the same edition he had found years ago and still secretly read. "You have read this?" he asked, surprised. Emma nodded and opened his battered copy that he kept in his saddlebag. When had she seen that? To a specific poem. She pointed to a particular line that read, "In silence there is eloquence. Stop weaving and see how the pattern improves." Xavier read the line, then looked at Emma, who was watching him with an expression of such understanding that it made his throat tight. She wrote in her journal, "I saw you reading this by the fire last night when you thought everyone was asleep. I have read the same poem 100 times. It is my favorite." "Mine too," Xavier admitted quietly. Emma smiled and touched the page, then his hand, and Xavier understood what she was trying to say, that they spoke the same language, that they understood the same truths. That silence between them was not empty but full of meaning. He wanted to say something profound, something that would match the moment, but Emma shook her head slightly as if reading his mind. She did not need words from him. She just needed him to understand, and he did. When Xavier climbed to the loft that night, he lay awake for a long time, listening to the sounds of the cabin settling, thinking about patterns and poetry, and the way Emma's hand had felt when it touched his. He thought about his plan to drift through life alone, talking only to his horse, avoiding the complications of connection. And he thought about how all those plans seemed suddenly less important than the idea of mornings making coffee with Emma, evenings by the fire with Ruth and Emma, the simple rightness of being somewhere he was wanted. The next day brought the first real snow, just a dusting that melted by afternoon, but it was a reminder that time was passing, and decisions needed to be made. Xavier had been at the cabin for over 2 weeks now, and he had finished most of the major work. The woodpile was enormous, the roof was sound, the stable was weatherproof and large enough for all 3 horses and then some. He had cleared the trail and reinforced the bridge over one of the streams and done a dozen other smaller tasks that Ruth had needed. He had no more excuses to stay, and Ruth knew it. She cornered him that evening while Emma was outside checking on the horses, fixing him with that sharp gaze of hers. "You have done fine work, Xavier Wolfe," she said. "More than I could have hoped for, but we both know the work is finished now." Xavier nodded slowly, waiting to hear what came next. "So the question is," Ruth continued, "are you going to ride out of here come morning and break my niece's heart? Or are you going to admit that you care about her and figure out what comes next?" Xavier felt like he had been punched in the chest. "I do not know what you mean, madam." "Don't insult my intelligence," Ruth said sharply. "I have eyes. I see how you look at her, how she looks at you. I see how the two of you move around each other like dancers who know the steps without being taught. Emma has not been happy, not truly happy, since before that bastard fiancé of hers nearly destroyed her. But she is happy now with you. And unless I am much mistaken, you are happy with her." Xavier wanted to deny it, but the words stuck in his throat because they would have been a lie, and somehow lying to Ruth felt impossible. "I do not know how to be with someone," he said finally. "I have been alone for a long time." "So has Emma in her own way," Ruth said. "But sometimes the right 2 people can be alone together, which is better than being alone apart. You think on that." She left him sitting by the fire, and Xavier did think on it. He thought about riding away in the morning, going back to his solitary life of drifting from job to job, speaking only to Rosie, avoiding entanglements. It would be simple. It would be safe. It would be exactly what he had been doing for 10 years, and it would be the biggest mistake of his life. The realization settled over him like snow quiet, inevitable, transforming everything it touched. Xavier had been running from connection for so long that he had convinced himself he did not need it, did not want it. But Emma had slipped past all his defenses without even trying, simply by understanding that silence could be a gift rather than a lack. She did not need him to be charming or talkative or anything other than exactly who he was. And somehow, without planning to, without meaning to, Xavier had fallen completely and irrevocably in love with her. When Emma came back in from the stable, stamping snow off her boots and unwinding the scarf from around her neck, Xavier was still sitting by the fire, trying to figure out how to say what he needed to say. Emma looked at him curiously, then came and sat beside him on the bench, close enough that their shoulders touched. Xavier cleared his throat. "Emma, I need to ask you something." She pulled out her journal, ready to write a response, but Xavier gently stopped her hand with his. "You do not need to write anything. I just need to say this." He paused, gathering his thoughts, then pushed forward before he lost his nerve. "I came here planning to do a job and leave. I have spent 10 years avoiding exactly this kind of situation because I thought being alone was simpler, safer. But somewhere in the past few weeks, everything changed. You changed it. And I cannot ride out of here tomorrow knowing I will never see you again. I cannot do it." Emma was staring at him with wide eyes, her hand still under his, and Xavier forced himself to keep going. "I know I am not good with words. I know I am better with horses than people. I know I do not have much to offer, no land, no house, just some saved wages and a good horse and a tendency to drift. But if you would consider it, if you could possibly want it, I would like to stay. Not just for another week or another month, but for good. I would like to be here with you and Ruth. I would like to build a life in this valley. I would like to." He trailed off, not sure how to finish. Emma was crying, tears running down her face, but she was smiling too, and she pulled her hand free from his only to reach up and touch his face with trembling fingers. Then she opened her journal and wrote something quickly, her hand shaking so much the letters were barely legible. "Yes, stay. Please stay. I love you." Xavier read those last 3 words and felt something break open inside his chest, something that had been locked tight for so long he had forgotten it was there. He reached out and pulled Emma into his arms, and she came willingly, pressing her face against his shoulder while he held her like she was something infinitely precious and fragile. From across the room, Ruth made a satisfied sound, and Xavier looked up to see her wiping her own eyes and nodding her approval. They sat like that for a long time, Xavier and Emma, holding each other by the fire while Ruth bustled around making tea and humming something that might have been a wedding march. When they finally pulled apart, Emma was still crying but laughing too, and Xavier felt like he was seeing the world in color for the first time after a lifetime of gray. The practical discussions came later, where Xavier and Emma would sleep now that their relationship had changed. How Xavier would earn his keep through the winter. What would happen come spring? Ruth solved the first problem by declaring that Emma and Xavier would take the loft, while she kept her bed on the main floor. The second problem solved itself when Xavier pointed out that there was always work to be done in the high country, hunting for meat, trapping for furs, maintaining the cabin and stable, making the occasional trip to Durango for supplies that would fetch a good price if carried carefully through the snow. As for spring, well, they would figure that out when it came. For now, Xavier had everything he needed: useful work, a warm place to sleep, and Emma beside him every morning and night. The first night they shared the loft, Xavier was so nervous he could barely breathe. He had been alone for so long that he had forgotten how to be close to someone, how to share space with another person. But Emma seemed to understand, the way she understood everything about him without words. She simply lay down on one side of the pallet and patted the space beside her. And when Xavier lay down carefully, respectfully, leaving space between them, she reached out and found his hand in the darkness. They fell asleep like that, hands clasped, and Xavier slept better than he had in years. The days developed their own rhythm as autumn turned to winter. Xavier would rise early and tend to the horses, talking to Rosie about Emma the way he used to talk to Rosie about everything else. Emma would make coffee and breakfast while Ruth planned the day's tasks. They would work together on whatever needed doing, preserving meat from Xavier's hunting, repairing tools, preparing for the deep snows that would come soon. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Ruth telling stories, Emma sketching or writing in her journal, Xavier reading his poetry or simply watching Emma with a contentment he had never imagined possible. Once a week, weather permitting, Xavier would ride down to Durango for supplies or to take furs and herbs to sell. Emma started going with him after the first big snow, riding her dun mare beside Rosie, the two of them traveling in comfortable silence through the white blanketed forest. In town, people began to recognize them as a pair, the quiet man who talked to his horse, and the silent woman who watched everything with clear, understanding eyes. The townspeople did not know quite what to make of them, but they respected Xavier's tracking skills and Emma's good sense, and the general store owner always had a kind word and a fair price. On one of these trips, in early December, Xavier stopped at the small church at the edge of town and spoke to the minister there, a young man named Samuel who had come west with more idealism than sense, but who had a good heart. Xavier asked in his halting way about marriage, what it required, what it meant, whether a woman who did not speak could still make vows. Samuel assured him that vows could be made in any number of ways, that the church recognized the sanctity of promises, regardless of how they were spoken, and that he would be honored to perform a ceremony whenever Xavier and Emma were ready. Xavier rode back to the cabin that evening with a small gold band in his pocket, nothing fancy, just a simple ring from the general store, but it had cost him 2 weeks' worth of fur money, and it was the most precious thing he owned besides Rosie. When he got back, he found Emma alone, Ruth having gone to visit a neighbor down the valley. Emma was sitting by the fire, sketching something in her journal, and she looked up with that smile that always made Xavier's chest feel tight. He crossed the room and knelt down beside her chair, suddenly terrified in a way that facing down 3 armed men had never made him feel. Emma put down her pencil and journal, giving him her full attention, and Xavier pulled the ring from his pocket. "I know we have only known each other for 3 months," Xavier said, his voice rough with emotion. "I know that is not very long, but I have never been more certain of anything in my life than I am of this. You are the only person I have ever met who understands my silence, who does not need me to be something I am not, who makes me want to stay in one place and build a life. Emma Ashford, will you marry me?" Emma's eyes filled with tears, and she nodded so hard Xavier thought she might hurt her neck. Then she grabbed her journal and wrote in large, emphatic letters, "Yes, yes, 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 I love you, Xavier Wolfe, and I want to spend every day of the rest of my life in silence with you." Xavier slipped the ring onto her finger and it fit perfectly, like it had been made for her. Emma threw her arms around his neck, and they held each other while the fire crackled, and outside the first stars came out in the cold winter sky. When Ruth came home an hour later and found them still sitting together on the floor, Emma wearing a gold ring and both of them grinning like fools, she declared that it was about time and immediately began planning a wedding. They married on a cold, bright day in January 1877, when the snow lay 4 feet deep and the world was silent and white. Samuel the minister rode up from Durango with 2 witnesses, and they held the ceremony in Ruth's cabin with a fire roaring in the hearth. Emma wore a dress that Ruth had been saving, ivory-colored and simple but beautiful, and Xavier wore his best clothes and boots polished until they shone. Ruth cried. The witnesses, a farming couple who lived down the valley, cried. Even Samuel got a little misty when it came time for the vows. Xavier spoke his clearly and firmly, promising to love and honor Emma for the rest of his life, to protect her and cherish her, and never ask her to be anything other than who she was. When it was Emma's turn, she opened her journal and held it up for Samuel to read aloud the vows she had written. I, Emma Ashford, take you, Xavier Wolfe, to be my husband. I promise to love you in silence and in speech, in words and in the space between words. I promise to honor your solitude and share my own. I promise to understand without explanation and to communicate without speaking. I promise to ride beside you wherever you need to go and to make a home with you wherever we choose to stay. I choose you, Xavier, today and every day for the rest of my life. When Samuel pronounced them married, Xavier kissed Emma for the first time, gentle and reverent, and Emma kissed him back with a passion that suggested silence did not mean absence of feeling. The witnesses applauded. Ruth hugged them both fiercely enough to crack ribs. And then they all sat down to a wedding feast that Ruth had been preparing for days: roasted venison, fresh bread, preserved vegetables, and a cake that must have cost Ruth a fortune in sugar. That night, alone in the loft for the first time as husband and wife, Xavier and Emma discovered that their silent understanding extended into this new territory as well. They learned each other slowly, carefully, communicating through touch and breath, and the kind of instinctive knowledge that seemed to flow between them like water finding its level. Afterward, lying tangled together in the warmth of their shared bed, Xavier felt more connected to another human being than he ever had, even without saying a word. Winter passed in a cocoon of snow and firelight and quiet happiness. Xavier hunted and trapped. Emma cooked and cleaned and began learning from Ruth how to identify and use the medicinal plants that grew in the valley. They made love often, and Xavier told Emma things he had never told anyone, murmuring into her hair in the darkness about his childhood and his losses, and his years of wandering. Emma would write responses in her journal by candlelight, or sometimes she would just hold him, and that was response enough. By the time the snow began to melt in March, Emma had not spoken aloud in almost a year, and Xavier had begun to wonder if she ever would again. It did not matter to him. They communicated perfectly well without her voice, but he worried sometimes that the trauma that had silenced her was still festering beneath the surface, unhealed. One afternoon in early April, when the 3 streams were running high with snowmelt and the valley was beginning to green, Xavier and Emma were working in the garden they were planting behind the cabin. Ruth had gone to Durango for supplies, making the trip on her sturdy mountain pony despite her age, insisting that she was not so old yet that she couldn't manage a trail ride. Xavier was turning soil with a spade while Emma followed behind planting seeds, and they were working in their usual comfortable silence when Emma suddenly stopped moving. Xavier looked up to find her standing completely still, one hand pressed to her stomach, her face gone pale. Emma. Xavier dropped the spade and was at her side in an instant. "What is wrong? Are you hurt?" Emma shook her head, but she kept her hand pressed to her stomach, and her eyes were wide with something that looked like shock. Xavier felt panic rising in his chest. Had she eaten something bad? Was she sick? Should he ride for a doctor even though the nearest doctor was hours away in Durango? And then Emma opened her mouth and spoke aloud for the first time since Xavier had known her. "I am pregnant," she said. Her voice was soft and a little hoarse from disuse, but clear and certain. "Xavier, I am going to have a baby." Xavier stared at her, processing the words. Emma had spoken. Emma had spoken, and she had said she was pregnant, and Xavier's brain seemed unable to handle both pieces of information at once. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "You spoke," he finally managed. "I did," Emma said, and now she was smiling, tears running down her face. "I was not sure I could anymore, but I needed to tell you this out loud. I needed you to hear my voice say it. We are going to have a baby, Xavier." Xavier let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob, and pulled Emma into his arms, holding her tight while his mind spun with the implications of everything that had just happened. Emma was pregnant. They were going to be parents. And Emma had spoken, had trusted him enough and loved him enough and felt safe enough to give voice to this news. "Say something else," Xavier whispered against her hair. "Please." "I love you," Emma said, her voice growing stronger. "I love you, Xavier Wolfe. You made me feel safe enough to speak again. You made me remember that words are not always weapons. They can be gifts, too." Xavier was definitely crying now, and he did not care. He kissed Emma's forehead, her cheeks, her lips, tasting salt from their combined tears. "I love you too, so much. You and this baby, you are everything." They stood there in the garden for a long time, holding each other while the spring sun warmed them, and the streams sang their confluence song. When Ruth came home that evening and they told her the news, Emma speaking it aloud, her voice still soft but definite, Ruth wept with joy, and immediately began planning everything that would need to happen before the baby arrived in the fall. Emma did not speak constantly after that day. She still preferred silence most of the time, still communicated through her journal or through gestures, still shared that wordless understanding with Xavier that had drawn them together in the first place. But she spoke when it mattered, when she had something worth saying, and her voice became another tool in their shared language rather than something she needed to fear. The baby came in October, almost exactly a year after Xavier had first found Emma on that forest trail. Emma labored for 12 hours while Ruth coached her through it, and Xavier paced outside the cabin, wearing a path in the dirt while Rosie watched him with patient eyes, and he told her over and over that Emma would be fine. The baby would be fine. Everything would be fine, even though he was terrified it would not be. When Ruth finally called him in, Xavier entered the cabin to find Emma propped up on the bed, exhausted and sweaty and more beautiful than he had ever seen her, holding a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets. Ruth was beaming and Emma was crying happy tears, and when Xavier approached on shaking legs, Emma held out the bundle. "Meet your son," Emma said softly. "Meet Jacob Wolfe." Xavier took the baby with trembling hands, terrified of dropping him or hurting him or somehow doing something wrong. But Jacob, tiny and red-faced and perfect, simply yawned and went back to sleep, apparently unconcerned that his father was having a moment of complete existential panic. Xavier looked at his son, at Emma, at Ruth, and felt like his heart might actually burst from the pressure of everything he was feeling. "He is perfect," Xavier managed to say. "You are perfect. I cannot believe this is real." "Believe it," Emma said, reaching up to touch Xavier's face. "This is our life now, our family, and it is very, very real." Jacob proved to be a quiet baby, which seemed fitting given his parents. He rarely cried, preferring to observe the world with solemn gray-green eyes that he had clearly inherited from his mother. Xavier took to fatherhood with the same focused intensity he brought to everything else, learning how to change diapers and soothe crying and walk the floor at 3 in the morning while Emma recovered from the birth. He talked to Jacob the way he talked to Rosie, murmuring about everything and nothing, and Jacob seemed to find his father's voice soothing. Emma recovered quickly, tough in the way that women who survived trauma often were, and within a few weeks she was back to her normal routine with Jacob bundled against her chest or napping in a cradle Xavier had built near the fireplace. Ruth had never been happier, doting on her great-nephew with the kind of love that seemed to make her younger despite her advancing years. The winter after Jacob was born was harsh, with storms that lasted days and temperatures that made Xavier worry about the horses and the supply situation. But the cabin was well built and well stocked, and the four of them, Xavier, Emma, Jacob, and Ruth, weathered the cold together, creating a world that felt complete and self-contained. On the worst nights, when the wind howled like something alive, and the snow piled so high it blocked the lower windows, they would all gather by the fire, Ruth telling stories, Emma nursing Jacob, Xavier sitting close enough to touch them both, Rosie and the other horses safe in the stable outside. Spring came eventually, as it always did, and with it a decision that Xavier and Emma had been discussing in their quiet way throughout the winter. The cabin was home, and it always would be, but it belonged to Ruth. Xavier and Emma wanted something of their own, a place they could build together, a ranch maybe where Xavier could raise horses, and Emma could grow herbs, and Jacob could have siblings and space to run. They found the perfect spot that summer, about 5 miles further up the valley where a creek split off from the main confluence and ran through a meadow that was sheltered on 3 sides by mountains. It was still on Ruth's leased land, close enough that they could check on her regularly, but far enough to feel independent. Ruth gave them her blessing and a portion of her savings to help with the building costs, and Xavier set to work constructing a cabin that was larger than Ruth's, but built with the same careful attention to detail. It took all summer and into fall, but by the time the aspens turned gold again, Xavier and Emma had a home of their own. It was simple but solid, 2 rooms and a loft, a stone fireplace, windows that faced east to catch the morning sun. Emma planted a garden and started drying herbs to sell in Durango. Xavier built a proper stable and began acquiring horses, planning to breed them and sell them to ranchers who needed good mountain stock. They moved in on a crisp October day, almost 2 years exactly from when they had first met. Ruth came to visit that first evening, bringing bread and salt and blessing for the new house, and they ate dinner together while Jacob toddled around exploring everything. When Ruth left to ride back to her own cabin, Emma and Xavier stood in the doorway of their home, watching her disappear into the dusk. "Happy?" Emma asked, speaking aloud because she knew Xavier loved to hear her voice even if she used it sparingly. "More than I knew was possible," Xavier said honestly. He looked down at Emma, at the gold ring on her finger and the smile on her face, and he thought about how close he had come to riding past that clearing 2 years ago, to ignoring the scream and staying out of whatever drama was unfolding. He thought about all the years he had spent alone, convinced it was what he wanted, what he needed. "Thank you," Xavier said softly. "For what?" Emma asked. "For understanding silence, for understanding me. For letting me be exactly who I am while still pulling me into something bigger than myself." Emma turned in his arms and kissed him, slow and sweet. "Thank you for the same, and for saving me, not just that day on the trail, but every day since." They stood together in the doorway while the stars came out, and somewhere in the stable Rosie whinnied softly. And inside the cabin, Jacob was humming to himself as he played on the rug by the fire. It was not the life Xavier had planned, not the solitary existence he had convinced himself he wanted. But it was better infinitely, impossibly better because it was shared. The years that followed were good ones, marked by the kind of steady contentment that makes for poor drama but excellent living. Xavier's horse breeding operation grew successful, his animals known throughout Colorado for their sure-footedness and good temperaments. Emma's herbal remedies developed a reputation too, and people would ride from Durango and beyond to buy her salves and tinctures. They made a good living, enough to be comfortable if not wealthy, and they saved money with an eye toward the future and Jacob's education. Jacob grew into a thoughtful child, quiet like his parents but not silent. He spoke when he had something to say, and the rest of the time he was content to observe and think. He had Xavier's dark hair and Emma's gray-green eyes, and he was equally at home helping his father with the horses or his mother in the garden. By the time he was 4, he could ride well enough to make the trip to Ruth's cabin on his own pony, and he adored his great-great-aunt with the kind of pure love that made Ruth declare she would live to be 100 just to watch him grow up. When Jacob was 5, Emma became pregnant again. This time she told Xavier immediately, speaking the words aloud one morning in bed before they rose to start the day. Xavier's response was more measured than the first time, less shocked surprise, more profound gratitude, and he spent the pregnancy being attentive in a way that made Emma laugh and tell him she was not made of glass. Their daughter was born in March 1881, during a late snowstorm that seemed determined to make things dramatic. Emma labored hard and fast, and Ruth almost did not make it through the snow in time to help with the delivery. But she did make it, and at dawn on a day when the world was white and hushed, Emma delivered a healthy baby girl with a shock of dark hair and lungs that proved she had inherited none of her parents' quietness. They named her Rose, after Rosie, which seemed only fitting given how much of Xavier's life and happiness could be traced back to his faithful mare. Rose Wolfe was everything her brother was not: loud, energetic, demanding, fearless. She kept Emma and Xavier running from the moment she could crawl, and Jacob watched his little sister's antics with the patient amusement of an older sibling who knows better but loves anyway. Ruth passed away peacefully in her sleep in the summer of 1883, at the age of 82. She had lived to see both of her great-great-niece and nephew thriving, had seen Emma happy and healed, had seen Xavier transformed from a solitary drifter into a devoted husband and father. The family buried her near the 3 streams she had loved, and Emma spoke at the service, her voice clear and strong as she talked about the woman who had given her shelter when she needed it most, who had brought Xavier and Emma together, who had shown them what family could be. Xavier inherited Ruth's cabin and land, and they decided to keep it as a place for visitors or hired hands, maintaining it in Ruth's memory. The main house in the meadow became fuller as the years passed. Another son born in 1884, another daughter in 1886. Xavier and Emma never planned their family in any deliberate way. Children simply came, and they welcomed each one with the same wonder they had felt when Jacob was born. By the time Xavier was 40 and Emma was 37, they had 5 children ranging in age from 16 to 6, a thriving ranch, a community of neighbors who respected them even if they found them odd, and a love that had only deepened with time. Xavier still talked to his horses more than to most people, and Emma still used her voice sparingly, but between themselves, they had developed a form of communication that was so complete, so intuitive, that they often did not need words at all. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Xavier and Emma took a rare trip away from the ranch, leaving the children with a trusted neighbor and riding up into the high country the way they used to do before the family got so large. They camped beside a mountain lake, just the two of them and Rosie, who was old now but still game for adventure. They lay together under the stars, wrapped in blankets against the cold, and Xavier found himself thinking about that day 10 years ago when he had said his vows in Ruth's cabin. He had meant every word then, but he had not fully understood what they would mean, the depth of connection that would grow between himself and Emma. The way love could expand to include children and still remain focused and particular. The way silence could be its own form of intimacy. "What are you thinking?" Emma asked softly. "That I talk to the horses less than I used to," Xavier said. "Because I would rather talk to you." Emma laughed, that rare, beautiful sound that still made Xavier's heart skip. "I speak more than I used to, because I want you to hear me say I love you." "I love you too," Xavier said. "More than I have words for, which is saying something given how few words I usually have." They made love under the stars, slow and familiar and still capable of surprise. And afterward Emma fell asleep in Xavier's arms while he stayed awake watching the moon track across the sky. He thought about the life they had built, the children they had raised, the ranch they had created from nothing but work and hope and determination. He thought about the young man he had been, lonely and convinced of his own need for isolation, and he felt grateful to that version of himself for making the choice to help a stranger on a trail, for staying when he could have left, for opening his heart when every instinct told him to keep it closed. Rosie whickered softly from where she was tied nearby, and Xavier smiled in the darkness. "I know, old girl," he whispered. "I know you told me so. You were right about her from the start." When Jacob turned 18, he announced his intention to study veterinary medicine in Denver, and while it hurt Xavier's heart to watch his oldest child leave the ranch, he was fiercely proud. Emma cried when they put Jacob on the stagecoach, actual tears that she let fall without shame, and Xavier held her while they watched their son disappear toward his future. But the ranch was never empty. The other children filled the space Jacob left, and there were always animals being born or trained, always work to be done, always neighbors stopping by or travelers needing directions or help. Xavier and Emma's home became known throughout the region as a place of hospitality and quiet refuge, somewhere you could rest without needing to explain yourself, somewhere you could be silent and understood. Rose grew into a skilled horsewoman who helped Xavier with the training and breeding operation. The younger children showed their own talents and interests, one drawn to Emma's herbal work, another to the business side of the ranch, the youngest showing signs of being an artist. Xavier and Emma watched their children grow with the kind of bittersweet pride that all parents feel, knowing that each milestone toward independence was necessary and right, but still a small loss. On a cool October evening in 1893, when Xavier was 53 and Emma was 50, they sat together on the porch of their house, watching the sun set behind the western peaks. The children were all inside preparing dinner, arguing good-naturedly about something, and the sound of their voices drifted out through the open door. Rosie had passed away 2 years before after a long and good life, but Xavier had kept her name alive by naming every sorrel mare he bred Rosie something: Rosie's daughter, Rosie's pride, Rosie's joy. Emma was leaning against Xavier's shoulder, and he had his arm around her, and neither of them was speaking. They had been together for 17 years now, and the silence between them was comfortable as old leather, warm as a good fire. Xavier thought about all the words he had not said over the years, all the conversations he had avoided, all the ways he had held himself apart from other people. And then he thought about Emma, who had understood from the beginning that silence was not absence but presence, that you could communicate entire worlds without speaking, that love did not require constant articulation to be real and deep and true. "I was thinking," Emma said eventually, her voice soft in the gathering dusk, "about that day you found me, how terrified I was, how certain I was that my life was over, that I would never feel safe or happy again." Xavier tightened his arm around her. "And now?" "Now I cannot imagine any other life," Emma said. "Cannot imagine not having met you, not having built this with you. You saved me, Xavier, in every way a person can be saved." "You saved me too," Xavier said. "I was alive before I met you, but I was not living. You taught me the difference." They sat together in silence for a while longer, watching the light fade and the stars emerge. Inside, someone called that dinner was ready, and Emma stood, reaching down to help Xavier up even though he did not need the help. They walked into the house hand in hand, into the warmth and noise and beautiful chaos of their family. And Xavier thought that all of this was worth more than all the silence and solitude he had prized for so many years. Because the best kind of silence, he had learned, was not the silence of being alone. It was the silence of being understood. And he had found that with Emma, had built a life around it, had raised children who knew that love could be expressed in 1,000 different ways, and words were only one of them. That night, lying in bed with Emma's head on his shoulder and the sound of their children settling down for sleep in the other rooms, Xavier whispered into the darkness, "Thank you." "For what?" Emma whispered back. "For understanding silence better than most, for understanding me. For 17 years of being exactly who you are." Emma kissed his shoulder, then said something she did not say often but that Xavier treasured every time he heard it. "Thank you for talking to your horse more than to people. It meant that when you talked to me, I knew you meant it." They fell asleep like that, together in the silence that had brought them together and the love that had grown from it, in the home they had built and the life they had chosen. And if Xavier dreamed that night, he dreamed of mountain trails and autumn aspens, of a young woman who needed saving and a young man who needed to learn how to be saved, of all the words he had never said and all the silence that had said them better. The years continued their steady march, bringing changes and challenges but never diminishing the bond between Xavier and Emma. They grew older together, their hair going gray, their hands becoming weathered with work, their faces lining with age and laughter. But the way they moved together, the way they communicated without words, the deep understanding that flowed between them that never changed. If anything, it deepened, became more profound, until sometimes Xavier felt like he and Emma were not two separate people at all but two halves of something whole. Their children grew up and made their own lives. Jacob became a successful veterinarian in Denver and returned home often with stories of his work, and eventually with a wife and children of his own. Rose married a rancher from over the pass and raised horses like her father, visiting frequently enough that Xavier saw his grandchildren grow from infants to sturdy children who loved the mountains as much as he did. The other children found their own paths, some staying close to home, some venturing out into the wider world that was changing rapidly as the 19th century gave way to the 20th. Through it all, Xavier and Emma remained constant, the still point around which their family revolved. They ran the ranch together, made decisions together, grew old together. And they were happy not in the dramatic, passionate way of young love, but in the deep, contented way of people who have built something lasting and true. On a spring morning in 1902, when Xavier was 62 and Emma was 59, they rode up to the spot where they had camped on their 10th anniversary, where Xavier had first realized the full depth of what he felt for his wife. They were older now, moving more carefully, but they could still ride, still seek out the high country, still find joy in silence and space and each other's company. They sat beside the same mountain lake, eating a simple lunch and watching the water ripple in the breeze. Emma had spoken more in recent years than she had in the early days of their marriage, but she still preferred silence most of the time, and Xavier was exactly the same. They had been sitting quietly for almost an hour when Emma suddenly took Xavier's hand. "I want you to know," she said, speaking carefully, "that every single day of the last 26 years has been a gift. That I have never regretted choosing you, staying with you, building this life with you. That you are the best thing that ever happened to me." Xavier felt his throat tighten with emotion. "I feel the same, exactly the same." "I know," Emma said, smiling. "I have always known. That is the beauty of understanding silence, you know, without being told." They sat together until the shadows grew long, then rode back down to their ranch, to their home, to the life they had created. And if their children noticed that both Xavier and Emma seemed particularly tender with each other that evening, particularly grateful, they chalked it up to the deep love that had always existed between their parents, the kind of love that did not need grand gestures or constant articulation, because it was written into every moment, every glance, every comfortable silence. The ranch thrived for decades more, passing eventually to Rose and her husband, then to their children. Xavier and Emma lived long enough to see great-grandchildren, to watch the 20th century transform the West from the wild frontier they had known into something more settled and civilized. They saw automobiles replace horses on most roads, though never on their mountain trails. They saw Durango grow from a rough mining town into a proper city. They saw the world change in ways both wonderful and troubling. But some things did not change. The mountains remained, enduring and eternal. The three streams still converged in the valley where Ruth's cabin stood, maintained now by various family members as a memorial and retreat. The silence of the high country remained as profound and healing as it had always been. And the love between Xavier and Emma remained steady and true, a constant in a changing world. Xavier Wolfe died peacefully at the age of 79, surrounded by his children and grandchildren, with Emma holding his hand and speaking quiet words of love that only he could hear. His last words, spoken to Emma in the voice that had always been reserved mainly for her and for horses, were simple. "Thank you for everything, for understanding, for loving me, for being exactly who you were." Emma lived another 5 years after Xavier passed, staying on the ranch that they had built together, riding up into the mountains when weather permitted, tending the horses and the garden and the memories. She spoke more in those years, as though losing Xavier had loosened something in her that had required his presence to hold in place. She told her grandchildren stories about their grandfather, about the silent man who had saved her life, and then given her a new one, about the deep understanding they had shared, about the way love could be communicated without words. She died quietly in her sleep on an October night, exactly 50 years after Xavier had first found her on that forest trail. Her children found her in the morning, and they said she looked peaceful, like she was simply resting. In her hand, she held Xavier's old poetry book, open to the page with the line they had both loved. "In silence there is eloquence." They buried Emma next to Xavier in the small cemetery overlooking the meadow where they had built their home, near Ruth's final resting place by the three streams. The family gathered from far and wide for the service, and one of the grandchildren read from Emma's journal's entries she had written over the years about Xavier, about love, about silence and understanding, and the unexpected blessings of choosing to speak or not to speak. The ranch continued, generation after generation, and the story of Xavier and Emma became a family legend: the quiet man who talked to his horses and the silent woman who understood him, who had found each other and built something beautiful from their shared preference for silence over noise, understanding over explanation, presence over performance. Their descendants would ride up to the high country and visit the places Xavier and Emma had loved, and sometimes they swore they could feel their presence still, in the silence of the mountains and the wind through the pines. Because some loves are so profound that they transcend death, existing not in words or even memories, but in the very landscape where they were lived. And in a certain valley in Colorado, where 3 streams converge and aspens turn gold every autumn, the love between Xavier Wolfe and Emma Ashford still lingers silent, understanding, eternal. A testament to the truth that the deepest connections need no words, that silence can be its own eloquence, and that sometimes the people who speak the least say the most important things of all.